When Lars and the gang at IBIS first invited me, which was not 2 months ago, it was more like 6 years ago, I first came here to discuss these things. We were sort of stuck in that conversation. There is a resource curse. These countries are not getting the real benefits. And we started to talk about some of the remedial actions, if you like. The ITI that I represent was at that time, we didn't have much to show for ourselves. It was a proposition more than anything else. It started to gain some traction. But it's great to be back here to hopefully report a little bit on what that traction is. I think the presentation that Lisa has given us has been a fantastic overview of all the sorts of things that needs to be done. And I guess sort of my starting reflection that I think we should have with us today is, okay, we're no longer identifying the problem. We recognize that there is a problem. We're also starting to have a pretty clear picture of the kinds of things that needs to happen. We need transparency, contract negotiation, capacity support, all various things, dialogue between the stakeholders and so on. Are we having a great impact? And I guess on that one, we have to remind ourselves we have an awful long way to go. We are making progress. We're actually making quite quick progress in terms of shaping, changing policy. Remarkably so. There wasn't much talk about these things when I was here first 6 years ago, so there is a much greater awareness. We have political support in a different way, as has been heard this morning and so on. But we have an awful long way to go in making a real significant impact on the grounds in these countries. So I think that as a reality check is something we have to bear in mind. So my first point is, as I've just said, we don't really need to talk about where things come from. I think that has been pretty clear. But it was out of this, and in particular this report, A Crude Awakening by Global Witness, almost 15 years ago, putting the spotlight on BP. BP, publish what you pay. BP said, okay. The Angolans got livid. The then head of BP said to Tony Blair, you know what, we've tried to go it alone, doesn't work, we need a collective approach. That was, in a sense, the starting shot for the ITI. It is, in a sense, a quasi-multilateral response to publish what you pay campaigning with IBIS and all the other organizations behind the Publish What You Pay NGO coalition. In the early days, the ITI was based on a very simple idea. Okay, let's start to have the BPs of this world report how much they've paid. And in those days, it was particular focus on some pretty hefty contract bonuses, signature bonuses, which were often left unaccounted for. In fact, they very often didn't reach the countries at all. Let's reconcile that. Let's verify those bonuses with what the government says that they receive. And then you would get, like in the case of Norway, an EITI report by someone independent, in this case by Deloitte, and you get a list of all the operators in Norway, how much the companies say they've paid, and how much the government says they've received, and if money has gone missing. And that was a great start. And it meant that we could forge a coalition around something very concrete, focused. We locked into a process. And tied to that very narrow technical focus, there was a very strong process element, in that in each of the countries that implement the ITI, and there are now 44, there had to be a national commission where that dialogue that Lisa spoke about can take place. There are about 1,000 people serving on these multi-stakeholder groups around the world today. My point here is, it's not a fly-in conference, let's put the torch on extractives for a day and talk about dialogue. Here is a fora that meets year in, year out where you build trust, where you talk about these things. If you don't get an answer from the government or the companies at this meeting, maybe you will at the meeting in 3 months' time. Anyway, so we had those two core elements, some basic transparency and what seemed to be linked to a pretty nifty, good in-country national process. And then, a couple of years ago, expectations had moved on. We started to see more campaigning. There was more legislation about reporting. And in some of these reports, they were way too aggregated. It was essentially just one figure bringing everything together. And that was an embarrassment for the ITI. So then a huge effort got underway, not least driven by our very ambitious independent chair, Claire Short, a former British Development Secretary. And essentially the starting point for that work was the ITI's got to do better. It's got to improve the quality of these reports, but there is a huge potential here. You're not living up to your premise, EITI, in terms of actually really seeing transparency leading to improved accountability. This document, this EITI standard, which was approved by all the, at that time, 41 implementing countries at a big meeting early last year. And what that essentially does is, apart from the disclosure that I've spoken about, it added quite a lot of other little things. And I don't know if you can see this, but if you think about it in terms of a kind of value chain that a lot of people use to describe this area, you have the oil and gas, minerals and metals on the far left. You have the sustainable development, schools and hospitals, citizens on the far right. You have a licensing phase, monitoring, production, tax collection, and then the government spending. So it's the company disclosure, government disclosure. Those were the two core elements. And as I said, the new standard contains a bit of quality improvement there. More broken down information. Each company has to report its payments in all of the countries that implement the ITI. But what was new then? One is that the ITI now encourages contract transparency. So you say, oh, you only encourage contract transparency. Be careful there. It's a clever encouragement. It says, if you're not going to publish your contracts, please explain why. That changes the burden of responsibility. It is quite hard politically to explain why you are against transparency. And remember, we are not a campaigning organization. We have companies like Chevron on our board. Remember, ExxonMobil is not a company famous for embracing contract transparency. They have put their name to this. I think that's a sign of progress. That's a sign of that a multi-stakeholder collaboration like the ITI is not a feeble, lowest common denominator by assumption. It can provide leadership. It can take policy where policy has not been before, where laws have failed or where purely voluntary things have failed. If we are smart in how we use our consensus, we can push it that way. And I think that the new encouragement of contract transparency is an illustration of that. There's also more requirement on data production, on state ownership, on transit payments. Lisa spoke quite a bit about CSR, corporate social responsibility, and here there are also new provisions. The new standard says if these are mandated, so if a government says you have to put aside $20 million every year to CSR around your facilities, then it has to be reported in these reports. And CSR things might not often be a huge amount of money, and as often said, the best thing you can do is just to make sure you pay the right taxes. But it is something that is often vulnerable to corruption. It's something that is often vulnerable to political interference, and it's something that often has a huge symbolic and can have a huge value for some citizens. So it does matter about CSR things. It is important to bring further transparency about these things. And if they are not mandated, these payments, they are also encouraged again to be included in the ITR reports. Let's look a little bit at what has happened around the world in these 44 countries. And I guess one of my key messages today is, let's not forget things like the EITI are tiny parts of a kind of big data revolution. Information is becoming available in all areas, all over the world, in a very quick way. And the key challenge then is, of course, to make sure that we can make use of it, to make sure that we have practically meaningful transparency. And that's why I'm showing this picture of some infographics from Nigeria on where the money, how much money it is, part of government spend, and so on, so forth. And here, I guess I have one clear recommendation to those from civil society or interested in their view. Been very good in this area at campaigning for more legislation, for tougher EITI, for this and that and so on, and that has been hugely important. But we now need to make sure that we have the capacity to use it. It is, as a campaigner said recently, we really got to smarten our act here, otherwise we have a false victory, unless we can now also start to use. How many of these EITI reports are used? Not many. It doesn't mean that they don't have value as a starting point, but there is actually a lot of interesting data that can be turned into policy, to recommendations, to campaigning, to questions in Parliament, to media discussion, and so on. But there is a tendency to shy away from that. It seems heavy, difficult, don't know how to do it. But I don't trust the companies, I don't trust the government, so I'll continue to pester them for more information, for the information I don't see. And maybe they should provide more information, but we've got to be a bit careful. In Mongolia, the report reached 1,200 pages. We'd clearly lost the track of what was relevant and important. This is a massively important conversation in Mongolia, and we managed to head off in a way that wasn't particularly practically meaningful. This is what the ITR reports are starting to look like. This is from Trinidad and Tobago, and it is, of course, just the front cover is much more appealing than this one, making sense of TNT's energy dollars. And it continues in this way with a lot of these kinds of figures. It's easy to grasp. And here I have another little recommendation. The donor community, of course, has its countries it loves. Everyone wants to work on Guinea-Conakry, who had some nasty dictators in the past, and now a benign government. Let's try to help them against some big companies. We want to work on Ghana and a couple of other countries. And they need help. But we've got to be careful. There are many countries that need civil societies and donor help that may not be quite as attractive and sexy and so on, that might have dwindling resources, so it's not quite as future interesting, but where the nation's dependence is just as bad. And Trinidad and Tobago, I would argue, is one of those countries. It's also really interesting with countries like that because you have a huge, well-educated, upcoming young middle class who cares. If you go out on the street in Guinea or Timor-Leste and so on, the awareness is not there, and you know, education isn't there. I'm not saying one shouldn't work in those countries, but there is an interesting aspect with some of these growing young economies and the kind of resonance that you can find in citizens and the kind of engagement you can reach relatively quickly in such countries. Here is a bit more from the TNT report. All right, the following pages are a couple of illustrations of these sorts of new things that are coming through with this new EITI standard. And one of the reasons why we got the standard through is that it largely built on good, if not best practice around the world. We would never have been able to have sold it otherwise. Just a little bit on what you can easily find on the internet from Norway about the various licenses. And that sort of information is now being encouraged around the world. The Liberia EITI, they are using their website to also publish key contracts. Again, many of these contracts cannot be read and understood, but it does a huge amount in terms of building trust, in showing which direction the government is going in. This slide on its own, shot from the internet, is really significant. And it is remarkable how quickly this contract transparency trend is spreading from country to country. Another thing that we need to see much more of in terms of making EITI things more practically meaningful is some more contextual information. This Norwegian report is pretty poor in that sense. We don't link it up to other things. We have to make sure that we integrate these things, that we stop having a sort of fancy-pants EITI as something separate and much more embed it in government systems. Integrate part and parcel of how business is simply done in these countries. And therefore, we need to link it much more to other information sources within governments and explain how these figures relate to overall economic growth, private sector development, and so on and so forth. Another area that we're seeing more of as terms of this contextual information is countries provide the legal framework. And it sounds rather basic with just a page listing the relevant legal sources, but it can be a nightmare in many countries. And it's the kind of transparency that is critically important, not least when one tries to grapple and understand with newly negotiated contracts. Production data, here's another one. Again, really important that we start to see it coming. And this is on hard rock stuff. We need to start to really, a big challenge is to, on the hydrocarbon side, start to run production data against revenue data from things like the ITI. Again, I think we don't need to focus a lot today here on why all of this is good, but let's maybe quickly remind ourselves a little bit. I think that in countries like Ghana, to look at the first point, this managing of expectations is really critical. We've seen that in Ethiopia, in Kenya, where there are new fines and expectations shoot up, and the government doesn't stand a chance in hell of managing these expectations. And it's a sort of self-evident argument for transparency, but still really important. One needs to be clear, communicate precisely what's going on and how these windfalls over time can benefit. And therein lies a huge challenge. And I think this also would be one of the strongest reasons that we have discussed when we've had contact with colleagues from Greenland, that this is a really important aspect for why we think that Greenland, with or without Denmark, is implementing the ITI. In post-conflict environments, building trust, and as a head of state once said to us, we said it was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, we said, to attract foreign direct investment, and she sort of interrupted and said, no, it's to attract quality foreign direct investment. That is why we're engaging in these longer term things. In complex country sectors such as in Nigeria, DRC, and Kazakhstan, simply being a diagnostic tool, finding out who's doing what and tracking the money. And there's a really interesting challenge with, in particular, the DRC and Nigeria. There are 55 people working at Nigeria EITI in Abuja. 40 people work at the EITI in the DRC. They're doing really good work, even if we have some corruption and problems internally there as well, or have had at least. But anyway, on the whole, they're doing really good work. Does that mean that things are rapidly improving? No, that would be to say too much. It takes time. And of course, during that time, during the journey, you will see a lot of dirt coming up. And that can sometimes give the impression that things are actually getting worse. So how do we carry our audiences with us on the journey to fight corruption, to improve governance? And here one can make an analogy to the Swedish development debate that completely undermined the citizenry's willingness or interest and desire for development in Sweden started to evaporate as one started to talk more and more about corruption, because they thought, oh, all aid just goes to corrupt countries and corruption, it doesn't help. So the aid will fell quite dramatically in recent years, whereas actually, in part, I think that Sweden was doing something good. They also got quite a bit wrong, but they did something good in starting to focus on some really important governance things. And we experience in our little world of the ITI this conundrum very clearly in Nigeria and the DRC. Chad, again, as an example, really just starting to be a diagnostic, finding out, starting to sort things out, what further reforms needs to be done, and so on. And then, lastly, in countries like Norway, can facilitate access to information in a simple and comprehensive format. I think my main point here would be, don't look at all OECD countries in one single way. Now with the UK, the US implementing the ITI, we are quickly learning that there are many different good reasons for why OECD countries also ought to be doing this. Not just a matter of sending an international signal, but there are some things that needs to be improved in many of our own countries. Here are just some more infographics and billboards and things used as we go along and learn how to communicate this, how to take this to wider audience, how to do it in different ways. Just a little bit of statistics. So I mentioned there are 44 countries. I mentioned some of which they are, there it says 120. There are now just under 200 of these CITR reports. $1.2 trillion worth of taxes and royalties have been churned through these and been made transparent for the first time in many cases. What's my point about bragging about size? It's that we are, in a sense, getting to a critical mass. We're starting to learn a little bit how to use this and how to compare, how to package it better, how to learn. But as I said, the real answer, if we're going to be successful, lies in the extent to which we're managing to use this new standard as a platform for progress. The ITI is, of course, multi-stakeholder, as I mentioned, both internationally with its own board, with everyone represented, and in country with operators and civil society represented. And that has been a very important aspect of the EITI. And I guess that one lesson or recommendation or observation here is something like the EITI it actually takes just about all stakeholders out of, for a better word, but the cliche, but their comfort zones. And what that means, it requires leadership. It requires leadership by London Mining to be here to say, okay, here are some longer-term governance things that we need to engage with if this is going to work. For all the chaos in Thailand at the moment, a couple of the companies there are really pushing that government to work on these issues. Oil and gas is not be an end-all for Thailand, but it's a significant sector, again, one of those countries under the radar. And that kind of leadership we need, and I guess there's a kind of governance lesson here in that something like the EITI, fundamentally, its success to no small extent depends on that kind of leadership. On government side, diplomats, and I was one, are pretty good at talking to each other, but not to other sectors and actors. And as a Norwegian ambassador said to us, well, what you guys are doing is a kind of innovative diplomacy of working with these other actors. And I think that's very true, and we need much more of that, and we need to learn from our many mistakes and some of the things we've got good at. This is when Obama announced the commitment to the EITI a couple of years ago. It's a significant picture in that, of course, first one was the then Norwegian Prime Minister, and the fact that Norway started to implement the EITI opened the door for the US to do it. It's a significant picture in that Dilma Rousseff is there, and we haven't made huge amount of progress with Brazil yet. I think we will. But there is a wider lesson here. If we're going to succeed with this sort of stuff, we need global standards. There's no question about that. We can't just throw aid money at things. We need to lock into processes and procedures and standards and hold to account. We have got away, sometimes we shouldn't, in Africa and elsewhere by imposing this sort of things. But forget it if we think that we're going to get away with that kind of rhetoric in large growing economies like Brazil, Mexico, and so on. These are nations that don't take kindly to do good in Europeans and Americans and so on. And we need them engaged here. And the ITI has worked, frankly, damn hard at trying to change that narrative. And the US decision, David Cameron in the UK saying we should be doing at home what we do abroad, that has in a way really opened up and helped. And now we are seeing the Mexicans, for example, preparing to come in. And that's a very exciting development that has knock-on effects also in Africa and beyond. Sorry, I'm coming to the end. So some of the key features of the ITI, one is this country ownership. We need laws in Europe on transparency, and of course we have one on the Transparency Directive and the Dodd-Frank in the US, but these are complementary efforts. You need in-country process as well, and that's why we think that the ITI and the kind of disclosure requirements that we have here now are very much mutually reinforcing. It should make the disclosure requirements at home should make EITI reporting faster, better, and cheaper, but it doesn't make the need for an in-country process for checking what the government actually receives for those national commissions any less relevant. If anything, they should have more to work from. On ownership, just as a sort of fun illustration, most organizations have a kind of logo protection policy. We have a kind of logo nationalization encouragement policy. Make it into your process in whatever way you think is good. Annual reporting, we've been through that several times. These reports, that remains the core. And one of my points here is, of course, again, the relevance may not always be here, but it's a starting point for a conversation that often drifts along the value chain. Yes, we now see where the money is coming from, but please tell us where is the money going? and it helps train the torch in those other directions. I've talked about the challenge we all have in making use of data. I think that's all I wanted to say. It's great to be here. The conversation in Sweden and Denmark hasn't been always that great, and it's, in a sense, it has bugged me a bit. I think it bugs me because I think there's a lot we can do. It bugs me because I don't think people really care in our countries where all of these resources come from. This supply chain sort of evaporates, or the interest evaporates along the way. We should care where all of these materials we have in our countries, we depend on where the stuff comes from. And it bugs me because I think there is so much more we can do. Through our development aid, we can encourage governments. We need to reward governments that do good governance. We can support civil society. We need to build this capacity. We need to work together on how we use data. And we need to reward good corporate leadership, prepared to take a longer-term view. And we need to put the focus a little bit more on the companies that seem a bit less willing to do just that. So I think there are a number of different ways in which and why it's important that we're here. And I'm very grateful to be invited back and for the leadership that you guys at EBS have provided in this arena for a long time. Thank you. I think the presentation that Lisa has given us has been a fantastic overview of all the sorts of things that needs to be done. And I guess sort of my starting reflection that I think we should have with us today is, okay, we're no longer identifying the problem. We recognize that there is a problem. We're also starting to have a pretty clear picture of the kinds of things that needs to happen. We need transparency, contract negotiation, capacity support, all various things, dialogue between the stakeholders and so on. Are we having a great to bear in mind? So my first point is, as I've just said, we don't really need to talk about where things come from. I think that has been pretty clear. But it was out of this, and in particular this report, A Crude Awakening by Global Witness, almost 15 years ago, putting the spotlight on BP. BP, publish what you pay. BP said, okay. The Angolans got livid. The then head of BP said to Tony Blair, you know what, we've tried to go it alone, doesn't work, we need a collective approach. That was, in a sense, the starting shot for impact. And I guess on that one, we have to remind ourselves we have an awful long way to go. We are making progress. We're actually making quite quick progress in terms of shaping, changing policy. Remarkably so. There wasn't much talk about these things when I was here first 6 years ago, so there is a much greater awareness. We have political support in a different way, as has been heard this morning, and so on. But we have an awful long way to go in making a real significant impact on the grounds in these countries. So I think that, as a reality check, is something we have to. When Lars and the gang at EBS first invited me, which was not 2 months ago, it was more like 6 years ago, I first came here to discuss these things. We were sort of stuck in that conversation. There is a resource curse. These countries are not getting the real benefits. And we started to talk about some of the remedial actions, if you like. The ITI that I represent was at that time, we didn't have much to show for ourselves. It was a proposition more than anything else. It started to gain some traction. But it's great to be back here to hopefully report a little bit on what that traction for the ITI. It is, in a sense, a quasi-multilateral response to publish what you pay campaigning with EBIS and all the other organizations behind the Publish What You Pay NGO coalition. In the early days, the ITI was based on a very simple idea. Okay, let's start to have the BPs of this world report how much they've paid. And in those days, it was particular focus on some pretty hefty contract bonuses, signature bonuses, which were often